Hello, this is Mike with MatterFix.io, and this is another one in our series of pro tips videos that we're doing for the Matterport service provider community. In these videos, we try and walk you through various problems that you might have with your Matterport camera, kind of how to diagnose what's going on, and then if a repair is required, what your options are. And for those of you who aren't familiar with MatterFix, we provide express Matterport repair services. We typically repair cameras and ship them back the day after we receive them. We can even do same-day repairs if you're in a rush and we know the camera is coming in ahead of time. We warranty our work for 1 year. We use only Matterport parts. We're authorized by Matterport to repair their cameras. Currently, we do out-of-warranty repairs. We do not do in-warranty repairs, so keep that in mind. So this video, we're going to do something a little bit different. We get questions about asking about the camera and referring to the different components and, you know, what is this called and how does this work? And so what we're going to do here is we're going to walk you through kind of the basic components that make up the Matterport camera, maybe comment a little bit about what can happen to them when a camera gets dropped. And then at the end, we've got a video that shows us assembling a camera from all the parts completely through to making a working camera and turning it on. We find this is, people find this pretty interesting. A lot of people use the Matterport technology and they kind of know what's going on, but it's interesting to see what actually goes into putting a camera together and how it works, all the way through. So today we're going to talk about, like I said, the various components that make up the camera, how they work together, what can possibly go wrong with them, maybe a brief comment on some repair issues that you might encounter. So you start with the camera. This, you're all familiar with it. This is a Pro 2. You have the mount assembly here, which is commonly this whole assembly inside is referred to as the clutch assembly. It includes the mount. There's a bolt that goes through. And then that's connected to the stepper motor, which turns the camera. Then you've got the stuff you can see from the outside, obviously, is the housing. You have the sensor array, which sits inside here. And then you have your power button, your battery level button, your OLED panel, and your charger port. So that's kind of the basics of the camera. So when you take a camera and you take the housing off of it, you can start to see a little bit more kind of separation what the different components are. You have the outside chassis, which is an aluminum frame that kind of holds everything together. Here's your mount. The clutch assembly is here. Here's a battery. The sensor array is here. It's held in by 2 rods. Then you've got your GPS antenna on the top, and it's mounted to a plate. Main board, you have one fan you can see here and another cooling fan that you can't see that's inside. So starting from the from the bottom working up, here's the clutch assembly. That's the mount. There's a shaft that goes through. It has bearings on it. And then this is really important. This is the main gear inside the clutch assembly. This gear can get damaged if the camera is dropped, if the clutch stepper motor is not adjusted right. It can strip the gear, and that can cause you rotation problems. Also, we've seen this main shaft that goes through get bent because the camera falls over when it's still connected to the tripod. In severe cases, we've seen this outside casting that kind of holds everything together. We've seen it get bent and even broken in a real hard fall. So that's the clutch assembly, and then it sits inside here, inside the chassis. And to give you a little better example, here's one that has some of the parts in it. So you've got your metal chassis, you've got your clutch assembly here, and then you have the next component we'll talk about is the stepper motor. That's a small, very high quality electric motor with a gear on it. And the gear turns against the clutch assembly and causes the rotation in the camera, the 6 stops that it does when it completes a sweep. So that's the clutch assembly, the stepper motor. Next you can see, we'll talk about the batteries. The Pro 1 and the Pro 2, each of them have 2 batteries. This happens to be a Pro 2 Lite with only 1 battery installed, how it comes. But the Pro 1 and the Pro 2 have 2 batteries. The Pro 2 Lite has 1 battery. The batteries are installed there. And as you're aware, the most common thing that can happen to a battery is it doesn't get charged frequently enough. The charge gets too low, the battery basically has a fail-safe circuit in it that cuts off and it has to be replaced. That's a safety feature that's in the camera. So now we've talked about the chassis, the clutch assembly, the stepper motor, the batteries. The next thing we'll look at is the sensor array. So this is the sensor array. This is a Pro 2 Lite, which is identical to the Pro 2. We have a sensor array here. This is from a Pro 1. But it essentially looks very similar to the Pro 2 or the Pro 2 Lite sensor array. The sensor array sits inside the chassis like this, okay, and it is held in place by 2 aluminum rods. Now, quite often when a camera is dropped, these aluminum rods can get bent, and what you'll see is you'll see a distortion. Most likely in the capture app, you'll see that the images aren't aligned correctly. In severe cases, you can get an unstable error or that, but that's something that fairly commonly happens to a camera when it gets dropped. So that's the sensor array sitting in here, the 2 support rods that hold it in place. The next component is this plate that's on the top, which it has the GPS antenna is mounted to it, and it has a cable that runs around and connects to the GPS chip here. This plate can get bent. This antenna cable can get damaged when the camera gets dropped. I believe the GPS antenna is used to help locate your outside images or to provide any kind of GPS information where it's able, if your capture app isn't accurately, or it supplements the GPS information that your capture app provides to give you geolocate addresses and to kind of generally locate your 360 images on the exterior scan of your scans. So that's the GPS plate, and that kind of covers, I guess we really didn't talk about the main board, but excuse me, the main board sits right in here. It is on this e-carrier plate, which that can get bent. We don't see it very often, but that can get bent occasionally. The e-carrier plate holds the main board in place. Also on that e-carrier plate, there are 2 cooling fans. We call this the case cooling fan. It kind of blows the bulk of the air out of the camera. And I believe this is one of the processor cooling fans. So there's 2 fans inside here that are on the e-carrier plate. These fans can go out, especially if the camera's been dropped. They can make noise. It's definitely something that if they're not operating correctly, they need to be replaced. So now I think we've gone through pretty much everything inside the camera, kind of what does what. And the last thing, so if you have a camera like this, the last thing that would happen is the housing would be put on the camera. And the housing is composed of basically the back, which has your power button, your battery level button. This is the OLED panel that displays your battery life and gives you the messages. And then your charger port here. That's the back of the housing. And then the other 2 parts of the housing are the front, obviously, and then what we refer to as the top plate now, and the bottom plate. Now, both of these plates, quite often when a camera gets dropped, the only thing that the user notices is the top plate has become dislodged or the bottom plate's off, and maybe the Wi-Fi antenna. The Wi-Fi antenna is attached to the camera, to the top plate in this position, and it has a cable that runs from it and connects to the Wi-Fi connector to chip on the main board. Quite often when a camera is dropped, the top plate pops off, and if that happens, most times the Wi-Fi antenna cable is torn, detached from the antenna or detached off the main board. So that's kind of one of the things you notice quite often. Like I said, this bottom plate will pop off. The bottom plate being off doesn't really hinder the operation of the camera at all. You can continue to use it. But the top plate in the Wi-Fi antenna is a fairly common issue that comes up that needs to be repaired. Without the Wi-Fi signal, you're going to get disconnections, slow transfers. It becomes almost impossible to scan with. And then last, the front plate. Typically nothing ever, we don't really see anything happen. In severe cases, this can get dented or something and need to be replaced when a camera's dropped. But usually there's no damage to this. So that kind of covers the whole camera, all the different parts that make it up and what they do. And next, we've got a little video. If you're interested, you can see us assemble a camera from all of the parts. I believe it's a Pro 2 Lite, but the same principles apply. Almost everything's the same except for one battery versus two. You can see us assemble the camera completely from all the parts, and at the end turn it on to a working camera. And a lot of people seem to find that pretty interesting. It gives you kind of an idea of how everything goes together. Just a quick review of the tools. You'll have your Torx bit driver handle, your various Torx bits, the splooger tool, wire cutters for cutting zip ties when you put the battery back in. I have a magnetic head here for the small screws on the stepper motor. I'll go over that when we do it. We've got the replacement vinyl that goes on the bottom of the chassis. For tightening the clutch nut, we have a Torx wrench here. We'll go over that, and the Loctite nut adhesive for adhering that or sealing that nut when you put it on. So that's kind of a quick overview of the tools. Just to go over the camera, the various parts while it's disassembled here. We have the chassis, which is basically the main frame inside the camera. We have what I call the mid plate. I think it may technically be called something else, but this is where the main board attaches, and then this plate is inside the camera. It kind of holds the main board in place inside the camera. Here's the back housing, which has the buttons and the LED display panel. Here is the bottom housing. This is where the mount goes through. Here is the top plate of the housing with the Wi-Fi antenna connected to it. This is the front of the housing. Notice that rubber bushing is attached here. It's best to have it here when you're reassembling the camera. This is the, I believe they call this the GPS plane, plate. It's a plate that goes on the top of the camera. The GPS antenna is mounted in the center of it. It attaches to the chassis. Battery pad, which goes on. We'll show you that when we're doing the reassembly where it goes. The sensor array with the 3 USB connectors on the back that connect to the main board. Here's the main board. There's the 3 ports where the USB cables connect from the sensor array. Here's the 2 ports where the batteries plug in. Since this is a Pro 2 Lite, we'll just be using one of those battery connections. And then this is where the stepper motor attaches. And if you, this is the ribbon cable connector on the main board. And this is where the charging port adapter plugs into the main board. And then we have the 2 fans. This is the clutch assembly. You can see the mount on the bottom. This is underneath the camera. This part attaches inside the mid frame. There's the clutch nut. The stepper motor, which fits inside the mid frame and mounts inside here so that this worm or screw drive actually connects against this plastic gear. So as this turns, it rotates this plastic gear, which turns the camera around. And then here is these are the two main rods that go through that mount their sensor array in place. And then here's the miscellaneous parts. Now, when you first start looking at reassembling one of these from the bottom up, it can be a little bit intimidating with all these parts, but you kind of just need to think of it in steps. So we break it down into steps and just focus on the particular step at a time as you go through, and then you shouldn't have any problem. The first step that we're going to do, or that you will be doing, will be taking the chassis, and you're going to want to mount the clutch assembly inside of the chassis. It'll basically go here. We obviously have to remove this to fit it down in there. And then at the same time, as we do that kind of simultaneously, we'll also be mounting the stepper motor. So those are the two things we're going to do first here. So for this, in this particular instance, I took this out when we did the disassembly. This is hand tight now. So what I'm going to do is take the nut off. Now you want to be careful when you're pulling out some of these assemblies. Actually, these bearings and stuff inside here can be loose. In other words, if you tip it over, they could all come out. And there's a number of different layers of parts in there, and it's just a lot easier if you never let that happen. So it can be difficult to reassemble those. So this particular case, everything's in firmly, so I'm not going to worry that much about it. Then you want to, there's the mounting holes inside the chassis, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this has to fit a certain way. You know, the hole's got to line up there, so if you line the hole up, there's basically one way it can go. So it's going to go there. And then what I will do is take there are 4 screws. This is using the the hex 1.5 size. Sometimes I think the newer ones have gone over to a T9 or a T10, a torque screw here, but essentially it's the same, just a different type of head. So I'm going to start these screws in and just loosely put them in to hold the clutch assembly in place. So I've got 2 of them in, the clutch assembly's in place. And I'm going to go ahead and put the other 2 in. Okay, and this is the 4th one. I'll show you. Now you can see here. So here is the 4 holes. So they're in there. I'll snug this one up a little bit more. You need to leave some play in them so that they will, the play needs to be in there so that you can fit the stepper motor in. It's actually a H2.0 is what this screw head fitting is. So you see I'm tightening them down, but I'm leaving a little bit of play in there. Okay, so now I'm going to flip it over. Now we're ready to go ahead and install the stepper motor. So the motor, there's 3 grooves there, and then there's 3 threaded inserts in here that it fits over top of. And so you slide it in, and there's a hole where the worm drive goes in to the clutch, and basically, boom, it's dropped in. Okay, so now at this point, the stepper motor's in there. I'm going to go ahead and finish. I'm not going to fully tighten these, but I'm going to go ahead and tighten them down to where the clutch assembly is tight, snug against the chassis. Okay, so they're not fully tightened, but it's in there, it's not moving anywhere. Now you'll notice the stepper motor basically is locked into place now. It needs that little bit of play to get it inserted there, and then when you tighten it down, it's essentially locked into place. Now, this next step that we're gonna do, for each of the there are three screws that connect the stepper motor mount to the chassis. And for each of those, you have a screw, you have a nylon washer, and you have a spring. And the order they go in is the nylon washer goes first, then the spring, and then the screw on top of that. Now this can get a little, it's kind of tight in there working. Be a little bit of a problem. The washers are pretty easy to get on, but then when you start getting to the springs and the screws, that can get a little bit tricky. So I'm going to set the springs for these two in place. And then what I found works good if you have I had a magnetic bit driver that was really good, but for some reason I can't seem to locate it. But having something that has a magnetic head on it, so this is a 1/16 inch Allen wrench, which is essentially the same size as that H1.5, the smaller hex head. And I rubbed it against a magnet, so it's magnetized. So see, it's not working. My plan was that it was going to be magnetized. So since that doesn't work, I'm basically holding them with my finger and kind of getting them started. So that one's started, that one's threaded in. So I'm going to go ahead and do this one, holding it with my finger, getting it in place, and then getting it started. Okay, so now we get to the most difficult one, the one that's kind of, it's a little tucked away kind of in the corner there. The stepper motor is pretty close to it. And so I'm going to put the spring in, got it in place. I'm going to drop this down, holding it with my finger, got it in place. So what I was using, that Allen wrench, is, like I said, it's a 1/16. It's the same size as this, the 1.5 bit that you should have. I'm just used it to start because it's easier to get in there. You can use whatever you want, either one. Okay, now I'm only going to tighten them down at this point to where they're fairly snug. I'm not really tightening them yet, just to the point where you start to feel good resistance. Okay. Okay, so now you'll notice that the stepper motor has some play in it. It can theoretically move that much. You're not going to want it to move that much. We'll adjust the stepper motor tension later on. You want to restrict it to a very slight, almost like a millimeter or two of play you'll want in there. So we'll cover that when we get to that point of tightening that down. So now the stepper motor's in place. The clutch assembly is in place. I'm going to go now back to the clutch assembly with the H2.0, and I'm going to throw them fairly, these need to be fairly tight. On some of if you ever take apart some of the older cameras, these can be a real bear to get out because they've tightened them and they put thread locker on them. The newer ones, it's not near as much of a problem there. So those are tightened down. I'm gonna go back to the stepper motor mounts, and I'm gonna go ahead and tighten them a little bit more now. So it was tight, and then I'm just going a little bit past. They were firm, and now I'm just tightening a little bit more there. So you want these to be fairly tight. And you notice you can still move it, but those the screws are tightened down pretty snugly. Okay, so now the next thing, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how to put on one of these since we took the screws out, we've torn the vinyl there. I don't go to the trouble of peeling the old vinyl off. I guess theoretically I could, but it's very thin. I don't think it affects anything. I'm just gonna put the new vinyl over. This can be a little bit of a problem. I've only done it a couple of times. So what I'm gonna do to assist me, I want the chassis to stand upright so I can work down on it. So I just use a clamp there. You can clamp it somewhere. And then, so this is, you see the hole here, this is how it's gonna go. So with this vinyl, you wanna weed it out first, which means taking out the pieces that aren't going to be used. And it's just the two upright pieces on the H's on either side. Okay. Okay, and I'll go ahead and pull the center hole out. Maybe. Yep, there. Okay, that's out of the way. Okay, so now you know it's gonna go this way. The key is to get it off of here and not wrinkle it up and get it onto the, so I peel both sides, there, and what I'm gonna do now is, that piece is stuck to itself, which is not good. Okay. Still stuck to itself. There. I am going to gingerly get it as close as I can, and then I'm just going to drop it. And it may not be perfect. And it's not perfect. But, and then you can work with your fingers and get the air bubbles out. I'm sure there's probably a better technique for doing this. You can actually punch the vinyl, put little holes in it, get the air bubbles out. Okay, because I left the other vinyl in, you can still kind of see the impressions from the screws, but it's in pretty good shape here, and it won't be noticeable once the housing and that is on it. Okay, so that's done. So now the next step is we need to go ahead and install the mount, the main bolt. So that gets slid through the bottom there. And then the nut goes on here. Now what I'm gonna do is, this is where you're gonna use the Torx wrench, and you're gonna tighten this nut down. Here's a torque wrench here. The setting for this is you want in foot-pounds, about 18.5 foot-pounds. And you see as this line goes up, when I'm at 0 here at the 15, so I'm at 15, 16, 17, 18, and 1/2. That should be good. I've tightened it up here at the bottom. You'll just follow the instructions with your torque wrench. And then I'm going to use that and tighten that until this wrench clicks, indicating that it's gotten to the desired tightness. Now, also you're gonna wanna put, before you tighten, you're going to want to put some thread locker in here. And the way I do this is I back the nut out where it forms a little bit of a cup. And then I'll go in and I'll put a little bit of thread locker around there. And you'll notice that the thread locker is kind of up against the edge. So when I tighten the nut down, that thread locker will be on the threads as it goes down. And then when I tighten it fully, when it's tight, I'm going to take a rag and wipe off the excess, because you don't want any of this to drip down on anything, because it can cause a real mess. So at this point, I'm going to go outside. I put my, I have a vise set up where the vise jaws clamp the mount here. I put a rag in there to protect so it doesn't scratch the mount or anything like that. But I'll tighten it up. This will be fixed Then I'll take the torque wrench and go around and tighten it to the desired tightness. And then I'm going to do that now. When I come back, that'll be done, and we'll go ahead on proceed with the rest of the assembly. Okay, so I've been outside with my vise, put the vise on here, mounted the camera, the chassis, and then I used the torque wrench and tightened it down to the specifications, and then wiped off the excess thread locker. So this is installed now. You'll notice though, if you push the stepper motor against it, it feels like normal. But if you don't push against it, there's nothing holding the stepper motor in place. It'll come out, and then that kind of spins freely. But when you're holding it against, that's the normal resistance you would typically want to feel when you twist this knob on the camera, if everything's lined up correctly. Okay, so that's done. The next step is we're going to go ahead and install what I call the mid frame. I think that there may be another name for it, but like I said, I call it the mid frame. And it goes, the orientation of it is, you know that if you push up here, you're not engaged with the stepper motor. You push down, you're engaged. So something needs to push down here. And if you remember, we backed this screw out. So this screw, when it's pushed threaded in, it pushes against the stepper motor, and that combined with the spring puts the pressure on the stepper motor to keep it properly engaged. So in order for this to push down here, you know that this mid frame needs to go in this way. Now what I'll typically do though is I'll put it this orientation with the knob, the mount closer to the top, and then you're going to slide the mid frame in here. Here's the part that's going to engage against the stepper motor. You're going to slide this in. This plastic frame, we'll take it out for now. And it's going to go in there and then pop down into place. But if you recall, we had I basically pulled the wings of the housing out, or the chassis out, and now this is in place and it just needs to be slid straight in. But you recall, the way this went back together is the washers go first. So there's two washers, and then on top of the washers, there's this spring that goes between the washers and the camera. So it's like you have to, at the same time, you kind of have to get that in place and keep the spring in place and slide it in. Now as you slide it in, it's going to reach a certain point where these screw threaded inserts will actually snap into these holes and line up. So there you heard a little snap there, snap there. So this is, the seams are tight all the way around. These inserts are inside here. So this mid frame is essentially in place the way that it needs to be. So now we're ready to go ahead and put the screws back in that hold the mid frame to the chassis. And if you recall, this is where to keep track of where they go, we put some little black dots around there, because there's quite a few different holes here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we've got the 6 screws here. Okay, these 6 screws here are the ones that go in those 6 holes. And this should be the H 2.0, the most common one of the hex. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. I'm not going to tighten it all the way, but I'm going to tighten it fairly snug. And then another one goes here. Okay. Another one goes here. When I took the camera apart the very first time, I had a little bit of a problem trying to remember which screws went where. That's why, like I said, it's handy to just make those little marks, and that way you don't have to worry about it when you reassembling them together. Okay, so now they're all down, and they just were kind of basically tightened, so I'm going to go back now and fully tighten them. You don't need to put a lot of pressure on them, but it just needs to be a firm tightening. Okay, so that's all 6 of those. So now the mid frame is in place, the stepper motor and the clutch assembly is in place. So now this is kind of one of the more nuanced part of putting it back together, and that is adjusting this. We want to get this set screw down where it's putting the right amount of pressure on the stepper motor. The way it is now, you can still push the stepper motor out quite a bit. So that's too much play in there. What you really want, so if I keep my hands on the motor, the stepper motor where it's fully engaged, that's your normal, kind of normally how it's gonna feel. You wanna leave just a slight amount of play in there. But see, I backed it off a little bit and it was almost at the verge of the stepper motor wasn't engaged. So I'm going to walk you through specifically kind of how we do this. Okay, so this should be a T10, I believe. Yeah, I should use the tools. It's the T9. This should be the T10. Okay, this is the T10, so this is the T10, the Torx 10. Now this adjustment can be done with the main board once the main board is in place. If the main board was sitting here, you notice there's a hole here, but you need to have a longer screwdriver to go down and make the adjustment here. So it can be done with the main board on. Right now it's off, it makes it a little easier to see. So I'm gonna go down to where it's maybe not quite a quarter of an inch, an eighth of an inch. The set screw is beyond flush here down inside. And then I'm gonna see if there's any play in the, see now I'm to the point now where it doesn't feel like there's any play in there, which you don't want that. It's really kind of a nuanced, it still feels like there's no play. Let me go again now. There, so there's play, but there's probably too much now. That might be right. It's just a little bit of play, but not to the point where you can ever spin this fast and hear clicking sound or it means it's disengaged. So I've got it, maybe there's not a 1/16 of an inch, a 32nd or a 64th of an inch of play in there. I'm going to tighten it up a little bit more. See there, I got to the point now all of a sudden there's no play. So I know that that's too far there. Okay, I think that's the sweet spot there. The reason you want that little bit of play in there, that plastic gear that the stepper motor worm drive rotates against, can be ever so slightly, you know, it's a precision machine part, but something, maybe there's a slight bend in the shaft or just something can be out, slightly out, which makes that maybe a little bit out of round. And if you're tight against it, when it rotates like that, it changes kind of the way the two are interacting. Whereas if you've got that little bit of play, if there's an out of round spot in that gear, it kind of compensates for it and it rotates correctly. So, like I said, that's probably one of the more trickier, more nuanced parts of the camera in general when you're working on the camera. But we've got that done now. So let's see, what are we going to do next? Typically, what I probably will do here is I'll go ahead and put the fan motors back in. There's a spring here. I must have had an extra spring from when I disassembled the camera. This is the stepper motor spring. I know there's 3 under there. I think when I disassembled it, one of the springs that was supposed to come out actually got stuck in the frame somewhere and it turned up. But you always want to make sure that all of your parts are accounted for when you go back together, that you've everything is in there. Those little springs can be a little bit difficult sometimes to keep up with, but I know there's one under each of those screws. Okay, so we're at this point now. I'm going to go ahead and put this, I guess, fan shroud. I don't know exactly what the technical term is for it, but it helps direct the airflow and kind of supports the main board. So that, in the older, some of the older cameras, there's actually like a rigid cardboard pieces that are glued to the frame, but this one is a removable plastic. So I'm going to drop that into place, and then if you remember when we were doing the disassembly, I went ahead and left the fans. Like you can see this fan here, this is how it came out of the camera. You've got 3 studs here that it goes into. I left the screws in, so you know there's no, that's the way that it goes back into place. There's no question about that. Like I said, it's a good idea sometimes to, until you get real comfortable with stuff, to take a picture of something before you take it apart. So when you're putting it back together, you make sure you get the orientation right. These screws should be the 1.5 hex. Now you don't need to overly tighten these. These are plastic fittings. They can crack if you, or plastic housing on the fan, which can crack if you over tighten it. So you just want them to be snug, firm. Okay, and then you see there's a little clip, a retaining clip here. This is where the fan wires go under. Kind of, I guess it basically just holds the fan wires in place. So that's one of the fans. And then there's a smaller fan. You can see the studs are here, but when you flip it over, that one, if you recall, was surface mounted here. And once again, there's 3 threaded inserts. There's 3 screws that I left in place, so there's no question about where it goes. This is not going where they're going. This is longer than I realized. Oh, that's the wrong. Look at me, I'm doing the wrong side. Almost like that is a Torx. Or maybe it's the 2.0. Let me see. Huh. I guess that's the 2.0, not the 1.5. Closer. I guess that actually is a Torx. Maybe it's the T9. Yep, sure enough. I was wrong on that. That's the T9. Some of these smaller screws, it's a little hard to differentiate what they are. But you can tell when you start screwing it in if it doesn't act right. So I know that this wire goes over. They've got a piece of Kapton tape here to kind of protect the, so there's no chafing on that wire. And if you remember when we took those apart, these two pieces here were kind of oriented like this and went into the board. So now we're ready to put the motherboard in place. So we need to think about the orientation. So you see the two fan fittings there. You know those have to be at this end. These are the battery connectors in the stepper motor. They have to be accessible through this hole, so they would go down. So you put them, oops, let me get this out. Actually, what I'm gonna do a little easier is just go ahead and plug the two, since I'm in the right orientation, I'm gonna go ahead and just plug the two fans in right now. Then I'm gonna set the board in place, and voila, there we go. So now we've got, if you recall, we have 8 screws that hold the board in place. So I'm gonna go ahead and start one in this corner. I'm not gonna tighten it. And I'm gonna go to the opposite corner, and I'm gonna put this in place. And this. This is definitely a well-secured board with these 8 screws here, but I guess that also provides the grounding for the board. Okay, board's in place, fans hooked up. I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of firmly, you don't need to torque on these screws at all. You just want a good firm seat. Okay, well, we're making progress now. So we got the board in, got the fans hooked up, and let's see, what do we want to do next? Let's go ahead and plug the stepper motor in. You can see there's a wire retainer here that's obviously designed for the stepper motor wires to kind of hold them in place, probably to keep them from getting too close to the clutch assembly there. And then this goes with the exposed side. The little connectors, you see one side is flat, you can't see any wires through it here. This side you can actually see the little connectors. That's the side that faces out, and it basically just slides right in. There's grooves, and boom, pop that in place. Okay, so that's in place. Now the next thing we're gonna do is put the battery in. Now we'll be doing a lot more extensive, detailed videos about battery installations. So this is the Pro 2 Lite, which only has 1 battery. You notice there's room for 2 batteries. One battery goes here, and a second battery would go here. So if you have the Pro 2, you're gonna have batteries on both sides. If you have the Pro 2 Lite, you're only gonna have a battery on this shorter side here. You notice this side is longer where the stepper motor is, the shorter side, and I'm sure the reason the battery's on this side is because it's closer to the center of rotation, or center of gravity, I guess, of the camera, as opposed to having the weight further out here. So anyway, on the Pro 2 Lite, the battery is gonna go on this short side here. This is the battery pack. It's a 4S battery pack with a proprietary battery management system board built into it. It's got an 8-pin Molex connector on it. Has a Mylar kind of padding around here. This is the newer battery. All the cameras now come with this battery. And when you always want to visually inspect a battery. You never want to put a battery into a camera or put it back into a camera if you've taken it out that has any physical damage. The main thing you'd want to be looking for is if somebody had put the wrong screw in and there's a puncture and goes down. If you have any doubts about a battery pack being damaged, you do not want to put it back into a camera. You don't do it, period. If you're doing a repair for a customer and push comes to shove, they've got a damaged battery in there and you can't get them to pay for it or something like that, you just need to eat it and put in a good battery. You just cannot put a damaged battery back into a Matterport camera, period. So you see this battery pack, looks really good. I don't see any signs of damage. It's one of the newer ones. I'm going to put it in with a label facing towards the stepper motor. The cable's coming towards the center out like this. And then the Molex connector, it's an 8-pin and it's got a little clip here, and the clip locks into where it plugs into on the board here. So what I'm going to do is turn this around, orient it the right way, and then I'm going to, I can't even see, so I don't know how anybody else is going to be able to see here. Let me see, maybe this is about as good as you can get. So there's the connector it's going to go into. I line it up correctly. Maybe. Okay, it's lined up and I'm going to push it in. You notice the fan turn. That's pretty common when you reconnect a battery. So it's lined up. Now, some of these newer batteries, when you plug them in, they require a fair amount of force to make the connection correctly. So I never like to put a bunch of force on the board without supporting it from behind. So I'll put my thumb behind here and then I'll push on the connector and you can feel it seat all the way down. So I know it's fully seated. Okay, so the battery's in, it's fully seated, the little lock connector is in there. So this battery's in correctly. Now the next step then is there's a pad that's always installed. So this is the orientation of it. It's like a capital I or something. The rounded corners go up, you slide it in here, and it's going to be here, and it's going to be there when you, the zip ties that you're going to put in are going to hold it in place. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to steal a piece of tape here for a second. I usually like to have an extra piece of tape around for this. I'm just going to take a piece of tape or something and basically tape that, and that's just holding it in place. We'll do the zip ties. So you got 2 zip ties. This is pretty important here. The zip tie, you want it when you're finished, you want the locking portion of it to end up right on this corner of the battery. You don't want it out here where it can rub against the sensor array or anything like that. You want it here. So what I do, I start with the zip tie like this. I push it out through that square hole here, and then I gauge it to where, okay, so I want it to end up about there. So I'm going to hold that with my thumb, and then I'm going to go around here. This is another thing that's important. When you come out here, you need to go over, you go through the hole, but you go over these 2 plates here. That's part of what holds the zip tie in place and allows it to hold the battery in place. So you go through the hole, over top of that, and then back into the chassis. When you push this in, it's not gonna it's not gonna want to go in. It's gonna hit against the clutch. So I go take this tool, find the end of it, just bend it a little bit, get it around. So now that's inserted through there. Now I want to go back to my gauge here. So I've got it like this. I want it to end up about there. So I know that's, and I kind of work around and push the slack out of the zip tie. Then I'll go ahead and engage the zip tie and adjust it again. There. Now, eventually we're going to be using a tool that puts a certain amount of tension on there, on the zip ties. you just want to make sure you put a lot of, you want these tight. See how this is kind of out here? This is too loose. You want to, I take and actually just use the chassis in my thumb and push, and you can see how tight that is there. You really get a lot of, you can get a lot of leverage by pushing the zip tie there. Okay, so that's in there, that's good and tight. Now the second one, basically the same as the first one, it's just a set of holes that are lower. Put it in, gauge how far you want it to go out the back, make sure you've gone over that metal piece and then back into the chassis. It's stuck down there. I use my little tool to thread it out. I get started, get it engaged where it's blocked a little bit. Then I make my final adjustment on where I want it to end up. And then I push the slack out of it. Come back here, and pretty good. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm using my hand here and pushing my thumb and then holding the other end of the zip tie, and you can really put a lot of pressure on those zip ties that way. And there again, you can see that zip tie is flat. That's what you want. Okay, so that battery is in place. Obviously, if you had a piece of tape in there now, you'd take it off. And you want to take side cutters now, go in, clip off the excess of from the zip tie. Obviously, make sure your cables are out of the way so you don't accidentally cut a battery cable and you gotta redo everything. Okay, so that battery is installed correctly. And like I said, we'll have another video that's gonna deal exclusively with just the batteries. So we're making good progress here. We're a good bit of the way done at this point. So now the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put the sensor array back in. The camera's oriented, the mount away from me. It's open, this top plane is off for right now. This will go, the GPS top plane piece will go on here, but it's kind of handy to have it out of the way when you're at this point. You can see inside there better. So what I'm gonna do is, it's facing away from me. I know that this upmost, most exposed sensor USB connector goes towards the bottom of the camera. That's the orientation. So I'm holding it there, I tilt it up, and I take that first cable, and you wanna make sure the first cable goes into the first USB connector. The middle one goes into the middle one, and then obviously the bottom one goes into the bottom one. Now, at this point, fairly soon, we're gonna have some special tape that's gonna be used always to make sure that these USB cables stay locked into place. For right now, what I'm doing is using Kapton tape, which is what Matterport has used in the past. I'm just gonna take 3 pieces of Kapton tape, and it's kind of just a little extra security for keeping the cables. Sometimes when the cameras get dropped, especially the Pro ones, when they get dropped, sometimes those cables can actually become dislodged enough where it affects the camera. So, okay, so I've got Kapton tape, all those 3 are in place, the sensor array. Now I'm gonna go ahead and set it down. It's fairly easy to figure out how it goes in here. So I set it down here. Look there, make sure that cable is not rubbing against the clutch pieces. That looks good. Okay, now, next thing is we're gonna take the rods to go through. There's 2 rods that hold the sensor array in place. So I'm gonna, now another advantage to not having that top plane on here is you can actually look inside and you can see. It's real easy to slide if that's on there, sometimes it's a guessing game to get that slid into place. Okay, so I'm putting this second one through. You notice now it doesn't want, this is fairly common. Sometimes if it doesn't go one way, these rods can go either way. So you see that time didn't go one way, but when I pushed it in the other way, it slid right in. Now, you don't want to have to, there shouldn't be any torque or anything on it. It shouldn't be like you have to push it down to get the rod to go in. You need to position it right, no tension on it, and put the rods through, because you don't want this. This needs to be kind of free floating and just held in place by the rods. Okay, so we got both of the rods on there. I'm going to go ahead and put the retainer clips on at this point on the rods. These are those two little clips that we took off at the beginning. Now you notice that the rod's not pushed through enough unless I push the camera. There's a little groove in the end of the rod that the retainer clip fits in. So I'm going to actually push, just physically push it together and then slide the clip down. So now the clip is there in place. I'm going to take, I have a flat screwdriver that I use. This is a good thing to use for a big flat screwdriver, but if it's oriented right, you get in there, but basically you should just pop and it should pop into place. Okay, so that's the one, but remember there's two. So I go over here, there, okay. So I pushed a little bit, I got it started. Boom, so that's in place. You want to make sure they're fully engaged in that groove and held in place. This is another thing too that you can notice. See these scratch marks here? This particular camera has been taken apart a number of times by me and apparently I guess by somebody else. If you see these scratches here, you'll notice that you probably know that somebody's been in there and taken the camera apart. I'm not sure if these happen with when Matterport works on the cameras or not, but I know typically when I work on a camera, sometimes there'll be scratches, and I've noticed other ones that come in. So that's just a sign to look for as to whether or not someone's been into a camera. Okay, so we're back to this point here. Everything's looking good. So we're ready to go ahead and put the top plane on, or the GPS plane. And if you recall, that just had 4 screws. So we go back to our nicely organized screw tray here. And these 4 here, these are Phillips. So we'll find our Phillips bit. Okay. I won't tighten it all the way, put it most of the way. Same here, most of the way. And just for convenience, I'll make it a little bit easier. I'm gonna flip it over. And I'm gonna go ahead and this one in. And number 4. Now, if your chassis is bent or something, this could give you an indication that your chassis is bent if you're having a hard time getting these screws lined up correctly. But on the Plus, if you do get this plate fitted back, if the plate isn't bent and you kind of get it all fitted back together and lined up, this plate can serve to kind of pull the chassis, pull back into kind of the proper form that it should be in. Okay, so that's on. Remember, this is the GPS antenna. We're going to go ahead and your typical little UFL connector, the round thing goes down. You line it up visually where it's over top, and then boom, you just push down. You can use your tool. I like to use my finger because I can actually kind of feel when it pops into place. And then we had a piece of tape here that I'm gonna save, and we're gonna use it for both of them. Oh, I've got tape there, we don't need to. Okay, so I'm gonna use one piece of tape here to kind of hold the, I don't like the positioning of that. It needs a little bit more to the center. And okay, so there. So now that's kind of out of the way when the GPS, when the Wi-Fi antenna, when we hook it up. Okay, so we're good to that point. So now we're to the point where we've simply got to put the, basically put the housing back on, and we're gonna be done. Okay, so you flip the camera back over. Here's the front housing. And it fits here. You remember there's that rubber grommet or bushing or whatever. It's good to have it on this side because you want to line it up with this hole. What I'm going to do is basically drop it down, make sure that's lined up. Okay. Boom. I felt it actually slide over the washer. there. Now, I've made sure that all of the screws are lined up, that it's fitted all 8, 4 on each side. Okay, so that it's fitted correctly. So I know that's fitted correctly. Now I'm gonna pull the right side out and lift it up at an angle. And I'm gonna slide the camera to the edge. I'm gonna orient the bottom plate correctly and get it into the groove. There. Okay. There. Okay. So you do is you kind of bend that out, you get this, kind of push it together, and then eventually it'll slide in, you'll feel it, it'll pop into place. And then when you get done, you want to make sure that everything's fitted back, everything's lined up, this is lined up correctly, so you see there's no gaps or anything, it's not rubbing there, so you know that's done. So you've got that together. Now we're going to go ahead and put the housing screws in, and I'm sure you recall, because I went over it a lot, but you're always going to put the battery screws, there's 4 screws on each side. The bottom one is where the batteries are in the camera, and there's specifically 2 screws, the 2 shorter ones need to go there. So you're always going to take those off first when you're disassembling a camera, and you're always going to put them back on first when you're reassembling a camera. It's very important. We don't ever want to put one of these longer screws down in these where these batteries are. They could theoretically go through and damage the battery. So that's, like I said, that's super important. So what I've done is I put those 2 in first. Now in this particular case, these side case screws are Phillips. Sometimes they're Torx, sometimes they're hex. The hex ones are lower profile. Something to keep in mind is if you're ever replacing a housing and the part you're using is a newer housing, it may not work with these side screws, like the Phillips that have the washers, because they stick out too much. The newer housings are a lower profile. So if you're switching over to a newer housing piece, you'll want to make sure you have, it's a screw, basically the same screw as this, it just has a very thin head on it, and it is a hex head. I believe it's the H1.5, similar to what the battery screws are here. But if you're doing a newer housing, you'll want to not use these thicker screws because they stand out too much, and the housings don't really fit back together correctly. You want to switch over to those lower profile ones, which you'll have those in the supplies you get from us. But that's just a little trivia there. I spent a couple hours one day trying to figure out why a housing wouldn't fit back on, and then I finally figured out it was the profile of the screws was just too high. Okay, so we got that done. Got 3 to put over here. And that's that. Okay, so that's done. Now we're back to the point of top plate and Wi-Fi antenna. Basically slide that in, rock it back and forth, it pops in, line up the same as we did before, line up the connector, put it over there, boom, pop it down. Use the plastic tool, I use my finger. We're going to take a piece of Kapton tape here, and we're just going to use it to secure that wire fairly close to the center. Okay, that's done. Now we're basically at the last step. So if you recall, so this is the back housing. This is the plastic kind of an insert piece that goes inside of the handle, gives it that rubbery, plastic, grippy kind of feel. I always typically keep that attached to the front the whole time while I'm working on the camera. It can be attached here too. It doesn't really matter. You just want to make sure it's in place, completely lined up. Okay, so now we're ready. First thing we're going to do is plug in the charger power connector cable. That just slides in. There's a little clip on the top. You can feel it lock into place. Pretty straightforward. Now we're gonna do the, bad lighting here. I'll try and do it from this angle. If you recall, this was a camera that somebody had been into, and they actually broke this ribbon cable connector gate. You can see it starts to fall off. But you'll want to use your pry tool and make sure that the gate is open. There should be like that 1/16 inch gap that you see in there now. And then I'm going to take the ribbon cable and I'm going to instead of go straight in, I'm going to try and go at a slight angle up and in. That gives you the least resistance. Okay. And when it's in, then you just push the gate in and the gate secures it in place. Okay, so we've got that hooked up. This is a good time you can do your little quick test here. Make sure that you're powered up. I mean, not powered up, but you've got connection. So you push that, you got the battery indicator, turns right on. That's a good, obviously that's what you want to see. If you don't get that, then you've got problems. Okay, so I'm popping that down, around. Okay, so here I have, I'm not liking the way that's going. Oh, I guess it's fine when the screw goes in. Okay, so I've confirmed everything fitting good there. And then I'm going to pop in the 4 main housing screws and then the 2 handle screws. Okay, so we're doing our the hex, the 2.0. So the bigger of the 2 hex bits that you have, which is right here. Just confirming everything looks good, the seams look good as you tighten. There. That one didn't want to fit in there right. This wasn't lined up quite right. You notice I had to kind of start that screw at a slight angle, but then it got threaded in and straightened up. You want to make sure that the screws are straight as they go in, but sometimes they're to finagle them a little bit when you get started. Okay, so now I'm going to find my T15 Torx. And meanwhile, while that's going on, I'm going to turn the camera on. Okay, that's done. And then the last but not least, we want to put the screw covers back on. Put them in place, push them down, make sure they're seated. There we go. Camera's powered up, back on, everything's good to go. And that's probably a little, last but not least, you don't want to end up with any parts at the end. I did have this spring left over, but I couldn't find it after the disassembly. It was stuck inside the camera somewhere, so I replaced it with another one, and then when I'm putting it back together, it magically showed up. So obviously you don't want to have any unaccounted for parts at the end. But it's a little intimidating the first time you do it. Some of the steps, especially that adjusting that stepper motor tension, can be a little bit intimidating. But like I say, if you take your camera and just gradually work through the videos, do it, taking it apart, putting it back together, step by step. You can have my video queued up and just pause it, and as you complete each of the steps. After you've done it 3 or 4 times, it's really not that difficult. And like I also said, don't get intimidated. Think about it in a step-by-step process instead of a whole bunch of parts that it's all going to go together. Think about, okay, first I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and if you break it down, it's actually fairly simple. Okay, so that wraps up today's video. I hope you found it interesting. You should have a good idea of kind of what the different components are called, and maybe a general idea of things that can happen to them when a camera, for instance, gets dropped. We would add in, we really don't suggest you taking the camera apart yourself. There are a very few real easy repairs, like replacing the Wi-Fi antenna, replacing the charger port, where we do have kits that we can send to you, and you can kind of walk you through how to do that repair and repair the camera yourself. But you need to be sure in those cases that there's nothing else going on with the camera. So overall, we generally suggest not opening the camera and doing anything yourself on it. We're here at MatterFix. Any questions that come up, concerns, you just want to know something, curious about something, message us on Facebook. We're usually monitor that pretty well. We've got a contact us form on our website, but feel free to reach out to us at any time. Thanks.